This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Oh, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Oh,
Good evening, friends, siblings, comrades. I am Ted Kelly. My pronouns are he and him, and I want to welcome you to this evening's Workers' World Party webinar on why we must abolish the police. For many of us who have been out in the streets protesting police terror and the lynchings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and Ahmaud Arbery, just to name a few, this question has become critically important for us to understand. I'm co-chairing tonight with Ezra Echo, a comrade from the Buffalo branch of Workers' World Party who uses pronouns they and them. But before I turn over the microphone to Ezra, I just want to say a little bit about what's going on the streets of Philadelphia. In recent weeks, hundreds of thousands of people have come out onto the streets to protest the murder, the state-sanctioned lynching of Black people across this country. We have seen cop cars overturned and set aflame right outside of City Hall. We've seen a deeply unpopular Starbucks that was built on public property torched. We have seen finally, after years of struggle, led in large part by Philly Real Justice, the removal of the racist monument to the arch-conservative fascist mayor Frank Rizzo, including the removal of a mural in South Philly, and even the Police Athletic League took down his name from their building. This summer, we also will be commemorating the 35th anniversary of the MOVE bombing and the state assassination of 11 MOVE members. We will also be commemorating the 25th anniversary of the death warrant signed and the attempted execution of Mumia Abu-Jamal. Right now, there is a global uprising, and Philadelphia has played an important part in that uprising. We will hear from comrades who are part of the Black Philly Radical Collective who've raised a series of incredibly important demands. And right now, just down the street from where I'm speaking to you, an encampment has formed that we hope will raise the question of police abolition and are taking the lead from the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. I'd like to start by saying red salute to the organizers and protesters in Seattle, and we support them wholeheartedly against the fascist threats by President Donald Trump. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Ezra Echo, who uses the pronouns they and them and is a member of Workers' World Party Buffalo, New York branch. Ezra is a new member of Workers' World Party. They are a non-binary lesbian artist and writer. Ezra, I know that the police have been particularly brutal to demonstrators in Buffalo who have been out in the streets since the police killing of George Floyd. Could you talk a little bit about what's been going on there and fill us in?
Yes, thank you, Ted. I've been working with Workers' World here in Buffalo for about a year now, and these protests are honestly nothing like anything that I've seen up until this point. They're just much bigger, first of all. A lot more people have come out to them. And the fire was really lit on Saturday night when the police actually instructed a car to drive into the protesters. And of course, the car got smashed to bits by everyone who they tried to run over and seriously harm and possibly even kill. And the police responded by throwing pepper spray, tear gas at us to try and disperse the crowd. And that was just the first day of a week-long stretch of curfews and tear gas and rubber bullets and fighting in the streets and bigger protests than here in Buffalo than I could have ever imagined, honestly. And it's incredible to see. But also, I have to mention the violent act against Martin Gugino by the police pushing him in. A lot of us know Martin here. He works with the Peace Center. Very peaceful, honestly. That's a good way to describe him. They're trying to make him out as some sort of agitator, as they're doing for a lot of people who are with these protests. And we know that that's not true, and we're going to keep going out in the streets and saying that's not true, and telling the truth and being out there and supporting this movement. Now, this webinar is organized by a revolutionary activists and members of Workers' World Party, which is an organization fighting for socialism. If you like what you hear tonight and want to check us out, go to www.workers.org and click on the Join WWP to sign up. You can also read the latest articles from our paper and check out the latest PDF of the paper. Now, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Megan Malachi. Megan Malachi is a proud native of Philadelphia. Her pronouns are she, her. She's an organizer and educator with the Philly Real Justice and the Black Philly Radical Collective. After we hear from all of the speakers tonight, we'll have a question and answer session. If you have any questions, please write them directly in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Megan, the organizations that you are a part of have a long history of opposition and activism against the brutality and terror of the Philly police. What insights and strategies do you have to share on the issue of abolishing the police? Please let us know what is happening in Philadelphia also.
So my organization has largely been a direct action organization. So when I say direct actions, I mean we've been responsible for many of the large protests and rallies that have occurred. And for us, that strategy has always been great to mobilize people. As we went on in our work, we had to consider that just the mobilization wasn't enough. And so we've learned through our activism that the deeper organizing, which is what we've been doing in the past 2 years, has been super important. Part of our work right now, and I think Ted mentioned it initially, is that we've been working with a bunch of other really awesome abolitionists in the city who are doing work the same as we are toward abolishing the police. And we came up with these really awesome demands that are abolitionist in nature and really speak to the many issues that we have in Philly. And so in these demands, we talk about, not just defunding the police for a momentary political action, but defunding the police leading toward abolition. In Philadelphia, we also have a problem with not just having to deal with the police of the city of Philadelphia, but having to deal with so many different types of police. So for instance, if you live in North Philly, you could be not only policed by the PPD, but you could be policed by the Philadelphia Housing Authority Police. You could be policed by Temple Police. You could be policed by SEPTA Police. So literally, no matter where you go in your neighborhood, there's some police force that is surveilling you, that is tracking you, that is in some way impeding your ability to be completely free. We also, in the demands, talk a lot about engaging with the problem of the fraternal order of the police. And so one conversation that we need to have as radicals and as leftists is the reality that many of our unions are not speaking out enough when it comes to disengaging themselves from the power of the FOP. As a unionized worker myself, I'm concerned that my union is aligning with the police. I'm concerned that we're not critically engaging with the fact that the police are not workers and that they're actually traitors to the working class. And so if I'm a working person and I'm on strike, it's not going to be my boss who works with me every day that's going to come out and crack me over the head to get me to disperse. It's going to be the police. And so I don't think that not only should we have to pay to be murdered by the police, but we should also have to pretend that they're a union as well. And so I guess I want to continue my talk for today with just some historical analysis about the police. I know the question that we're supposed to be answering and talking about today is why we need police abolition. But in my opinion, before we can begin to address that question, we have to know what the history of the police have been and how they have interacted with our communities. So I want to start out by raising up my grandfather. I was thinking a lot about him today. So funnily enough, my family has been in Philly since the 1700s, and I only have one grandparent who is directly from the South. And this is my mother's dad, John Lofton. He was from a place called Baker County, Georgia, which is southern Georgia, almost to where Alabama begins. And a lot of the Southern history, the things that I like about the South, come directly from him. But also another thing that comes from John Lofton, my grandfather, is my critique of policing, and is also my critique of white supremacy. And so growing up, he, like many Black elders, never explicitly talked about white supremacy, never explicitly talked about what his life was like in the South and why he left. But I always knew that there was something about white people and what he experienced. And after a while, I was able to get him to talk about some of those things. And he had a very clear dislike and critique of the system of enslavement, which we know led to convict leasing, which led to the system of Jim Crow, and it's also led into our current era of mass incarceration. So I think we have to pay a closer attention to those systems and how they have emboldened and weaponized the police. And so I want to talk a little bit about the system of slavery. So in my study of the police, I think a lot of us know that the police can be traced back to slavery. The original police were the slave catchers, or what my enslaved ancestors called the paddy rollers. If you ran away from the plantation or wherever you were enslaved, most times your so-called slave owner would hire a slave catcher to catch you. They created a psychological disease called drapetomania to say that Black people who had decided to run away from the system of slavery had a mental illness. And so the police were a part of that system. And so even after slavery is abolished, the police, or what used to be the slave catchers, don't go away, right? They spawn into, at least initially, these little militia type groups that were sometimes privately owned and privately hired by different landowners in the South to keep the now sharecropping class in place. But further we go into history, they become more professionalized. And so we see the professionalized police being weaponized against Black protesters during Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. And obviously, as we move toward the 1970s with the Black Power movement, we see how the police were weaponized in the 1990s. The first instance I can personally remember seeing with my own eyes, of course, was Rodney King in 1992, and how the police were weaponized against them and how they were not punished effectively. And all of this goes into the last 10 years or so, with the murder of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Mike Brown, the protests that we saw in Ferguson and Baltimore, leading up to our current political moment that we see in Minneapolis. And the one thing that connects all of these resistance to police brutality is the fact that Black people have been oppressed in this country for 400 years. And we cannot disconnect that reality from what we see in modern times. I would also say that the atrocities of police violence and mass incarceration has led us to this moment. But I think that we also cannot forget that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And I think that we have to critique how those conditions have also created this political moment as well. I think a lot of people who may not have had the time or the opportunity to sit down and think about these issues had the opportunity now during the coronavirus. So those are the people who were privileged enough to be able to stay at home and not work. And then you also have the people who had to take on this strange and unfair title of essential worker. The people who were basically being sacrificed to the system during the global pandemic and being presented as heroes without the recognition or the pay that they should have had to take on those roles. And so I think all of that has coalesced into creating the moment that we saw in Minneapolis, where people with all of their righteous frustration rose up against the system. And I think that the question of why we want police abolition is quite obvious if you consider the conditions that Black people and other oppressed groups in this country have experienced over a period of time and space of hundreds and hundreds of years. So the other thing that we want to address is, okay, we want police abolition, but what actually are we asking for? And so when I think of police abolition, I think of self-determination. Self-determination is just another way of saying autonomy or independence, right? And so we want the ability to strategically abolish the police in our community. And one way that my organization conceives of this is through a three-pronged approach called disempower, disarm, and disband. And our 13 demands really reflect this idea. The 13 demands, I think I might have mentioned it before, talk a lot about Philadelphia-specific things involving the police. But we also have three very important, immediately actionable demands that can be connected to the current political moment. So Ted mentioned previously that we finally got the Rizzo statue taken down, but we're not just concerned about the Rizzo statue. We're concerned about all images, all monuments, all signals of oppression in this city that lead back to the violent white supremacy that our people have experienced in this place. And so we're not asking, we're demanding that not only does the Rizzo statue come down, which has happened, and all the other things that Ted mentioned, but we also want the sign to Wilson Goode, the Black mayor who authorized the murder of the Moore family, to come down as well. We want other signs of white supremacist oppressors like the Columbus statue to come down. And we want those things replaced with symbols that are meaningful to our community. And just to wrap up, another really important demand that we have is dealing with the protesters. There are a lot of people who were arrested during the rebellion, and they're being, of course, criminalized like the city always does when there are protests. But we want to make sure that those people are not charged any further. We want to make sure that they have the court support that they need. And we also want to stop this narrative that Krasner and other city officials are trying to spread about this idea that the young people who were involved in the burning and what they call looting, but I like to refer to as a redistribution of material goods that was hoarded by corporations. They want to try to separate those young Black kids from the broader movement. And so maybe they didn't come to an organizing meeting, but they knew why they targeted certain sections of the city. And I watched them be very strategic about which places they decided to burn and take things from. And so we want to lift them up and make sure that they have the support that they need. And so we're just so happy to be a part of this movement and this conversation, and free them all and on the move.
On a move, Megan. Thank you so much. And that formulation, disempower, disarm, and disband, is such an important roadmap for abolition. Thank you, Megan, so much for being on. It's always an honor to hear you speak. We are going to go to our next speaker, Joshua Vincent. But I think first we're going to have a slideshow about some of those symbols of white supremacy, these monuments that Megan mentioned. So I think, folks, if our tech crew can start that slideshow, we can go into that, and then I can introduce our next speaker. Are we ready for the slideshow? There we are.
Only time, and who can say if your love grows as your heart shows? Only time. We are there. We are Who can say why your heart's
Oh, it's a beautiful thing to see these things come down, isn't it? Folks, our next speaker is Joshua Vincent Sankara, the Director of Education, Not Incarceration Network from Durham, North Carolina. He goes by the pronouns he and him. Joshua is a musician and a community organizer. He has previously served as a lead organizer and African-American outreach coordinator for the 2008 Obama for America campaign, Obama 1.0, and as the state coordinator and political director for the North Carolina NAACP in 2012. In 2014, Josh was the field director for Ignite NC and currently works for the Movement Voter Project. Josh and his brother co-wrote part of the musical score for the second season of Aaron Magruder's The Boondocks on the Cartoon Network. And recently they scored the first documentary on the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, called Ferguson, a Report from the Occupied Territory on the Fusion Channel. Welcome, Joshua. Josh, in the past few weeks, all over the country, anti-racist protesters have been defacing and taking down monuments and statues of racist soldiers and historical symbols. In Durham, a monument was torn down several years ago. Josh, can you talk about the struggle as well as recent protests going on to support Black Lives Matter and the fight against police lynchings and terror?
Yeah, Ted, thank you so much for that question, and a major thank you to all the folks and comrades on this call for taking the time out to get this update. Thank you to Monica, Judy, Ezra, Megan for your comments, and especially Megan for the historical context that you laid out before. I think that's an important piece to start at, because when we talk about the destruction or the destruction of community that racism and capitalism has had on our Black communities across this world, one of the main pieces that I identified through my own personal study has always been monumentation of white supremacy and the need to remove that as a kind of cultural reminder of cultural memory, and kind of creating a racialized space for people to occupy. And so when we begin to see that these monuments are coming down, not only in the United States, but around the world, these odes to white supremacy, it's an important and monumental kind of historical moment in the fact that what those monuments represent is not just an individual, but an ideology and an indication of a cultural memory that plagues society and introduces society to racist, capitalist, sexist, and classist ideology before we even necessarily have the particular lexicons to understand it. So I'm very appreciative of the role that these particular rebellions are playing in addressing the removal of these monuments to white supremacy around the world. like Ted mentioned, I am from North Carolina, Raleigh in particular. I was raised in, but Durham, I grew up as I spent the last, I guess, 20 years now almost in Durham, between Durham and Raleigh in particular, and have grown to know very closely lots of the movement members and folks who are resisting racism, resisting sexism, resisting classism inside the state of North Carolina and in the South in general. One of the things that I'd like to kind of point out is that, in the last 10 days of resistance across the country in general, but also in North Carolina, we have seen more happen in response to the fear of rebellion and the fear of resistance and the fear of uprising than we have in the last 20 years of organizing to elect progressive leaders into elected offices in across the country. And so what that means to me is that it is true that the idea of people holding the power over their government is real. And that's something that I think that as folks who love, who truly love freedom, right? Who truly love anti-imperialist government, who truly love what democracy is supposed to be, can hang our hats on. African people and indigenous people have been resisting this capitalist racist government structure since the first Africans and first Europeans came to this country, right? The Africans had resisted slavery and enslavement from the very moment they were put in chains. That indigenous folks in this country resisted colonialism from the very moment European settlers landed on the shores of what we now call the United States. And so what we're seeing now in 2020, in June of 2020, this first week of June 2020, is not anything new. It's a manifestation of a linear struggle that's connected beyond centuries to multiple centuries and connected to the resiliency of a people who love freedom and a people who love the people. And that's an important piece to me to highlight, right? Because as we operate in our world today, oftentimes the narratives we hear are trying to erase our connection to our long struggle of freedom. And as freedom-loving people that are on this call and around the world that are relating to this struggle, I would like to finally say, all power to the people, right? And may the struggle that we fight for live on, because we are gaining traction on the ways that we need to, and we know that we always had possibilities to do. And so I think it's important for us to kind of situate that properly, in order to not only pay homage and respect to the work, but also find guidance in the resistance and rebellions and uprisings that our ancestors and people who came before us kind of laid out before. The blueprint is already there. We're simply walking in the steps that were laid out. We're walking on the pathway that was kind of already carved out for us in this particular moment. As I think about what police and elected officials in Raleigh and Durham have kind of adapted this idea of the 8 can't wait kind of platform. And I don't have to go through the whole thing. I know many of you already know what that particular platform means, as opposed to abolishing the police and defunding the entire departments, right? And I saw a tweet earlier this week that kind of put this in context. It seems radical, the idea of defunding the police, until we realize that we've been defunding education in this country for years, right? And more specifically in North Carolina, we have completely defunded a public mental health program that was funded by the state, that was run by local counties that could tailor the needs to the constituents and the people that were being affected by mental health. And now, instead of treating those folks, right, they defunded the entire program, and every last one of those folks that had formerly been, in mental health hospitals and being under care of professional providers of mental health, now they're in jail, right? Or now they're involved with the carceral state in a way that's detrimental to their future, not only to their future, but their family's future and their future family's future, right? And so we know that, like, when we call for defunding the police, it is something that it's not a game for us. It's a real impact of on our everyday life, right? And then the other question is, like, I know the question around this is, why do we say the word? Why are we saying defund the police? Well, the question I have in response to that literally is, why not? Right? Is because if we've invested in police, quote unquote, for the last 50 or 60, 100, 200 years, right? We've invested in police and we've seen that this is the result that we're getting, then why not consider the idea of divesting or divesting from the police, right? We know what the militarized state will do to our people, not only in the United States here in the belly of the beast, but also around the world. We know what imperialism will do and how it will impact our people. And I want to also kind of take a moment really quickly to highlight the movement folks that have been across the cities in North Carolina and across the South that have been standing in solidarity and kind of holding the line, if you will, as we've seen this teetering between a kind of complicity of cooperation with the state and with the police department in particular, right? And then people who are trying to hold police accountable for holding them accountable to exactly who they are, right? And we know that they're murderous to our people. They're devastating to our communities, right? And so I want to lift up our comrades and our leaders in the Black Youth Project, BYP 100 in Durham, who led a rally a couple weeks ago. And one of the centering themes of the rally was that, cops, COVID, and capitalism are killing Black people, right? So there's no confusion in our mind about who the enemy is, who we're fighting against, and who we're organizing ourselves against. And that's important for laying the groundwork, not only for ourselves as we move forward, but the generations behind us that are watching us on a day-to-day basis, right? We don't want our children and our children's children to reflect on pictures of our movement folks taking knees with police. We want them to reflect on the movement creating possibilities that include their communities without police, right? That include an investment in their futures through education and opportunity, and not through the carceral state, right? And as I begin to close up here, one of the powerful things that I've been seeing across the country and in North Carolina and South Carolina and other places around the country and even the world really, is that this is drawn together this kind of collective orientation around the othering of other people of color in this world and their relationship to white supremacist United States, right? And that there's lines of solidarity and alignment and connective tissue between the resistance of funding the police, and then also defunding defunding and divesting from ICE. And so being able to draw those connecting points together is a powerful moment that we need to seize, we need to uphold, and we need to amplify with every ounce of our body and ounce of our being. And with that, I will close. Thank you all for this time, and I appreciate, looking forward to the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Before I introduce our next speaker, I would like to remind folks to put all your questions in the Q&A so that we can have a rich discussion. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can after our last speaker. Now I would like to introduce Monica Moorehead. Monica Moorehead is the managing editor of the Workers' World newspaper and editor of the book Marxism, Reparations, and the Black Freedom Struggle. 20 years ago, when She was the presidential candidate for Workers' World Party. Monica and 700 other activists were arrested by the DC police for illegal protest against the prison and industrial complex and for demanding the freedom of political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal. Most of the detainees were held overnight without food or water at a shut-down hospital in Anacostia and released the next day. The motivation for this mass arrest was to keep as many of the protesters from attending a militant protest against a global economic summit for bankers representing the richest capitalist countries. Monica, why does Workers' World Party believe that the police should be abolished, and is this the same as calling for the defunding of the police?
Oh, thank you, Ezra. Anyway, I just want to first say that it's really a privilege to be on the same program with Megan and Joshua. And let me begin to answer this question with this statement. What a historical, earth-shattering shift just 3 months has made. Who would have thought the main debate in the country and the world would be whether the police should be defunded, dismantled, or even abolished due to not one pandemic, but two pandemics, interconnecting with each other, resting on the ever-crumbling foundation of capitalism and its permanent crisis since 2008. The COVID-19 pandemic, which accelerated in March, early March, kept millions of people indoors, wearing masks and social distancing, killing over 100,000, and now there's a grim estimate that another 100,000 people could die before September. COVID exposed how capitalism was not or able to meet people's most basic needs like healthcare, income, food, housing, and more, with all the billions of dollars in emergency bailouts for the corporations at the expense of the suffering and pain for the masses, including Black and other peoples dying at alarming numbers, disproportionate to their overall numbers with whites. And then just weeks later came another pandemic, a rebellion sparked by the public torture and lynching of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The country was already sitting on a potential powder keg with the vigilante lynchings of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, Breonna Taylor shot 8 times in Louisville, Kentucky, Tony McDade, a Black trans man in Tallahassee, Florida, and more. But Floyd's murder lit the fuse of a powder keg that exploded worldwide into uncovering an ongoing war that Black and other oppressed peoples have been suffering from for decades: police terror. The masses risked their health and police brutality to resist in the streets day and night, to say enough is enough with the police lynchings without impunity. What makes this rebellion so unique is its multinational character, led by angry young people, that has changed the political landscape forever on a global scale. Every sector of society has been impacted on a global scale, and it's too numerous to mention. However, this is more than a rebellion against police terror. It is a rebellion, It is a rebellion against white supremacy. Just look at the pro-slavery, pro-cop, and pro-colonial monuments and statues that have either been burnt, torn down, defaced, and even beheaded, that glorified butchers from Christopher Columbus to Frank Rizzo to Robert E. Lee to King Leopold II. As someone whose roots are in the segregated South, this was so uplifting for me to see. The 72-year-old Confederate-based NASCAR just announced yesterday to ban Confederate flags, unheard of just 3 months ago. When the Defense Department announced plans to remove Confederate generals' names on 10 military bases, Trump strongly rejected that plan. Not surprising, since his base is composed of the KKK, neo-fascist, and white supremacists, many of whom are cops or cop sympathizers, as we saw in Charlottesville in 2017. And Trump's first campaign rally is going to, of all places, Tulsa, Oklahoma, site of the racist white vigilante massacre of hundreds of Black people 99 years ago. And just 4 years ago, there was the police murder of Terrence Crutcher, a Black man, and the white officer who killed him was never charged. You know that the ruling class's profits are being threatened when they send out messages pledging to support Black Lives Matter, including the union-busting trillion-dollar corporation, Amazon. This is all a ploy to try to co-opt this mass movement. Local, state, and federal legislators are scrambling to come up with police Band-Aid reforms to try to quell the protest. But right now, there is grassroots groundswell that goes way beyond reforms. Reforms that will not fundamentally change the untenable relations between the police and the masses, especially communities of color. From a Marxist perspective, the capitalist system depends on police and ICE, as well as mass incarceration, the courts, the prisons, and bias laws to maintain class dominance for the billionaires to hold on to their profits and to keep the masses powerless, defenseless, and isolated. Listen to see if this quote from Lenin's State and Revolution, written over a century ago, resonates today. This is a quote. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. The state is therefore, by no means a power forced on society from without. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in insoluble contradiction with itself, that it has split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes, with conflicting economic interest, might not consume themselves and society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power arisen out of society, but placing itself above it and alienated itself more and more from it, is the state. This speaks to what is going on today, comrades and friends, because not only the police, but the military are armed to the teeth to repress the rebellion of the people who threaten fragile capitalist peace and stability and bankers. This quote explains succinctly why we say abolish the police. This is not about good cops and bad cops. The police as an institution cannot be reformed because historically there can be no reconciliation between them and the masses. The police are an armed force created not to protect and serve the people, but to protect and serve the private property of the rich. But this task cannot be ultimately achieved unless the economic system the police and state serves and protects is also abolished. You can't carry out one without the other. Only the working class, the class that produces everything and owns nothing, can achieve this with the guidance of a revolutionary program of united organized revolutionary forces. At this juncture, a majority of the masses may say defund the police because they want some relief from the pain they witness and experience on a daily basis. But even if the rebellion wins this concession, defunding the police is still just the first step forward. The direct intervention of the masses goes through various phases, with spontaneity being only one phase. Another phase, there may reflect some necessary assessment on what the next steps are to move forward, to sustain momentum, until ultimately there is a national, independent, revolutionary developed program for real socialism, not social democracy that the Democrats hope to steer the masses towards with Biden as their 2020 candidate. And you can see really what's going on today in Seattle, creating an autonomous state there, and also the shutting down of the Holland Tunnel. These are very, very important experiences that any rebellion has to go through to gain that experience. And it's very important that throughout these different phases of a rebellion, that there has to be broad solidarity built to, to keep this going, to keep the momentum going. We can't allow these experiences to be isolated. Workers' World Party is ready to play a vanguard role of both being with the masses in solidarity with their transitional demands for community control, and at the same time making clear with the down-to-earth program to make the connections to the root causes of white supremacy, state terror, and why the fight against capitalism is the only solution to break down barriers towards building class unity, to meet all basic human needs. From everything we have seen over the past 3 months and earlier, the masses are ready for real social change. They are ready for a revolutionary change, which is monumental. If those who are listening tonight are also ready to make history, and you are looking for a revolutionary socialist party that has been preparing for what we are seeing today for over 60 years, please join our ranks with your ideas and energy and skills to help make us stronger for our class, for our movement, and for the struggle for liberation of our class. Black Lives Matter, abolish the police and ICE, smash white supremacy, build a workers' world. Thank you.
Build a workers' world. Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much. As Ezra mentioned in Monica's introduction, Monica Moorehead is a managing editor of Workers' World newspaper. And if you'd like to receive daily updates from Workers' World, it's easy. You can go to workers.org to subscribe. We've been printing a weekly newspaper, both online and in print. And the print version of Workers' World first began in 1959. Now, during the COVID pandemic, for reasons of that crisis, we suspended the print edition of the paper for health and safety reasons. However, we plan to get the print edition up and running in the very near future. And one of the reasons that we really put an emphasis on the print edition of the newspaper as well is because Workers' World provides free newspaper subscriptions to anyone who is currently incarcerated. Just in recent months, we have relaunched the Prisoner Solidarity Committee of Workers' World Party, and myself and Marinda Chrisman in Texas are the co-editors of the Tear Down the Walls page. It's a section in every week of the newspaper that is dedicated strictly to the prison struggle. So I recommend go to workers.org, check it out, subscribe. And if you're interested in supporting the prisoner subscription program, you can also go to our Patreon to donate at patreon.com/WWP. Now, I would like at this point to invite all our panelists and my co-moderator Ezra to turn their videos on so we can all come back together and participate in the discussion and the Q&A part. And this is my favorite part where we all get to be on at the same time and talk to each other. So we're going to take the first question from the Q&A. This one is going to be for any of our panelists. So if you want, you can raise your hand on Zoom, or you can just start talking, so we can get started now. The first question we have here is, within the context of this international movement against racist police terror and violence, and it is a global uprising, some people have raised the demand for community control of the police. What does this mean in the context of our movement, and can this be accomplished? That's our first question. I don't know who'd like to take a stab at that first.
I actually would, because it's a huge part of our demands. So in Philly, we have something right now called the Police Advisory Commission. And this was a committee that was created after Black people had complained, of course, about police violence and other forms of terror in the community. And so the city responded and said, okay, we're going to create this commission, but we're not going to give it any money. We're not going to give it any power. And so all you can do essentially is complain about the police and hope that, you know, someone might call you back. So in our demands, what we are proposing is the complete removal of the current Police Advisory Commission and having it replaced with a fully funded and powerful community control commission. And so part of that, of course, is the ability to hire and fire police officers. But just like defunding the police, we're not stopping there. This is just simply a strategy and a tactic that we're using to move toward complete police abolition. And within that specific demand, and I can't remember what number it is, we talk about how one of the main charges of this commission is not only to deal with the current issue of police violence and move toward abolition, but we're giving this commission at the most 5 years before we move toward abolition. And so to me, like, that's a very tangible goal. And I think we're in a political movement where we can really make that happen. And I think that what's happening now is a lot of the goals that we radicals have been talking about for years are being hijacked by liberals and other people, you know, who are attaching themselves to our goals because they just want us to shut up and go back in the house. And I think there is a risk that that could happen, but I honestly believe at this current moment, like, people are seeing like what's happening. They're like, yo, like, you've been like, you've been hustling me for years, and no, like, I'm not going to just defund the police. Like, we want these, you know, cops out of our communities. We want these police, you know, to move. And of course, we're going to still struggle with the community about issues of public safety. But I really think that people are starting to understand what we're saying and that these are things that could actually happen.
Thanks, Megan. Is there anybody else who'd like to take on that question of community control of the police? That was a great answer, Megan. Go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, that was a great answer. And just to add on to that, I think it's the, it does go back to the question of self-determination for any oppressed community that's been occupied, that's been brutalized for decades. And, you know, it's sometimes it's not, you know, it's not up to trying to convince, you know, liberals to understand, you know, these demands. And of course, you know, having solidarity is very, very important, but it's more important to, especially for revolutionary progressives and organizations, to defend the right of the oppressed community, to defend the community however they see fit. And I mean, frankly, it's been shown. Look at the Black Panther Party back in the 60s. When they were formed, they challenged, you know, the class rule of the police. They would set up, you know, people's, you know, patrols of the community to make sure that nobody was being brutalized by the police, because they used the First Amendment right to do that. And they they took the philosophy of Malcolm X, that self-defense is a right, especially against state repression, and they put that into action. And so whether the community wants body cams or, review boards, whatever those demands are, it's important for those communities to feel like that people have their backs, because they're going to come under scrutiny, and plus it's our money. It's our money. Why should our money go to institutions that repress us? As the speakers were talking about, that money should be going towards mental health, services, because the police are called, because, lots of time to, when there's a 911 crisis, if someone is in trouble or having some type of, mental issue or whatever, and the police come and they just shoot people down. That's their answer. So again, the community has a right to have that funding go towards services that uplift the community, and not to some institution that represses the community, that occupies the community. So our party, and I'll end with this, our party has always defended any oppressed community, Black, Brown, Indigenous, to community control of the police. It's very, very important to build that broad class solidarity.
Thank you, Monica. Our next question here is, Megan mentioned that here in Philadelphia, there's various kinds of police that you might have your life threatened by. It could be the housing authority police, the SEPTA police, the Temple police, different university security forces. And this question is, will abolishing the police leave a void in terms of a public security apparatus? And could this potentially be an opportunity for private security companies to fill that void? It's a difficult question. I don't know if anyone wants to take that one on.
I don't want to take up too much space, so that's why I was trying to be quiet. But I think definitely, I think that there will be, as we move toward this abolitionist goal, constant attacks, from, people trying to cash in on the void that's been left once we actually abolish the police. I was having a conversation with a comrade, and she said, girl, what are we going to do with these cops once we take away their guns and their pensions and stuff? Like, where are we going to put them? Which is, a huge question that we're going to need to address in the movement. But, I think that is part of the work that we're doing, not just saying we're going to abolish the police, but finding solutions to deal with those issues that come up. And we already know that they're, a problem in this moment right now. So as we're moving toward the stages of abolishing the police, we have to figure out like how we're going to address the capitalists who are going to, come like carpetbaggers and try to, institute private polices. What are we going to do with those cops who are left over, who are angry that they lost their jobs? And so there's going to be a lot of those conversations, I think, as we go forward. And that is a community conversation that we are really going to have. I'm personally afraid of all of these cops who are going to be angry about not having that same position. And then I think the broader question is, do we give them a place in the new society that we're creating? Are we going to give them counseling? Are we going to give them some type of reprogramming? Those are all like serious issues that, have to be addressed. And right now, I don't have any specific answers, but I definitely am considering them. And that's an awesome question.
Thank you, Megan. Does anyone else have anything to say about that question in particular?
Well, was that Joshua? You go ahead, Joshua.
Well, the only thing I was going to add was that there's constantly a moving of the goalposts. when it comes to those kinds of questions of like, you know, what do we do with the police, et cetera, et cetera. There's no consideration of what do we do if we can actually keep each other safe, right? And one kind of example I have of that is I was in Berkeley, California in 2015, when the 2015, when the uprisings began around the non-indictments of the killers of both Mike Brown and Michael and Eric Gardner. And I was in the streets, and there were people who were getting injured and being attacked by the police. The police didn't offer us any help or any consideration for medical reprieve. It was the people. The people had organized themselves to help ourselves. And so it's something sometimes as simple as I lost my keys at the protest. I said to a complete stranger, I lost my keys. And in a matter of 2 minutes, I found my keys by working with people in that community that I was in that was collectively resisting the police, right? And the police gave no assistance. And so to the idea that police are some kind of avenue towards safety is just a falsehood, right? That our communities and our individuals amongst ourselves, when we love and care for each other the way that we know we're supposed to without capitalist intervention, right? That's when we know we can take care of ourselves. So that's the only thing I'll add about that.
Yeah, and just quickly, especially in this country, you know, we've seen, you know, cops, some of them taking a knee and, you know, all that stuff. And I mean, you know, those, of course, those are individual cops, but I would say this: if you really want to show solidarity with the people, first and foremost, take off that uniform. Take it off. You know, it's because of what it represents. You know, there was a prison guard, a Black prison guard, who saw the murder of George Floyd and decided to quit. He said, I can't be a prison guard anymore because of what it represents. So, I mean, that's the first step towards, you know, consciousness, becoming more class conscious about what the role of the police is under capitalist society. Now, I'll say this: in Cuba, there are police. There are police, but who are they policing against? That's the question. What class are they defending in Cuba? And I'll just end with this: when I was there in 1997 for the World Youth Festival, and there was a huge parade of different delegations from around the world, including the US and others. And there were police there, but they weren't carrying any guns, not whatsoever. You knew they were police, no guns. They didn't look like they were, you know, getting ready for war, as we've seen in DC and Seattle and other places, no tear gas. They were there to protect our demonstration from any counter-revolutionaries that still are in Cuba. They're there to defend the gains of the Cuban Revolution. So until capitalism is wiped off the globe, and there's no need for, there's no more private property, there's no more exploitation, then you won't see police. But until that time, Cuba has to have police. It also has a people's militia, committees for the, you know, to defend the revolution in different neighborhoods. So the people of Cuba, they have their own, you know, people's militia and the CDRs, but they also have police to defend the gains of the revolution, because it's always under threat, because being 90 miles from the United States.
Thank you, Monica. I just want to drive home too that here, all of the protests were completely peaceful until the police came in, until they disrupted things, and until they started harming people. Everything was perfect. We have people who have come together to do to give water to people. People are giving out water left and right and food, and the community you see really coming together and being there for each other and providing for each other. And that's definitely one of the most beautiful things to see during this time. If no one else has anything on that, I'll move on to the next question, which is kind of two questions in one. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many groups, including Workers' World Party, have called for the abolition of prisons, jails, and detention centers. How does this fit in with the demand, abolish the police? And also one of the questions we got in the Q&A was, does anyone think that we should reconsider what we're calling for? X, defund the police, call it something else. This too could start the racist and extreme right-wingers to become more violent. I have a son who has to live and walk in these streets. Sorry, that was a long question, but if anyone wants to take up either part of that question or just the question as a whole.
Well, all the institutions that you mentioned, Ezra, including the police, the prisons, and so forth, they're all part of the repressive state apparatus. They're all connected together. Because, to put it simply, there's more of us than it is of the billionaire ruling class. they need this repressive apparatus, as I said before, to try to keep some type of social order. They would rather have peace. They would rather be able to exploit and repress people without any fight back or do it behind the scenes. But a rebellion changes everything. It changes everything. It just takes the cover off of everything that's been going on, as the speakers are talking about, like hundreds of years ago, slavery, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, and what's going on with indigenous people and migrants being detained and being, shot down at the border by the border patrol. All that gets exposed. And once people see all of this, and I think that's what we're seeing in the streets. People just couldn't believe that this was going on around the country until they saw a Black man being tortured and then asphyxiated, for almost 9 minutes in the streets. And so all of a sudden the light bulb goes off. And so now there's the opportunity, because that class consciousness is opening up, to learn more. I read when a very famous coach was saying, I never knew about the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre. I was never taught about it in school. But now they want to be educated, as to what this was all about and what does it have to do with, the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggle against white supremacy, to make all those connections. So we're talking about the state. We really can't separate the courts and the repressive laws, the prisons, the police, ICE. They're all part, even the media, they all play a very important role in terms of keeping down the masses. We're trying to keep down the masses. And but I don't think it's no going back now because of what's going on today. The rebellion has changed everything. I mean, everything. And so it's just a really great development.
Thanks, Monica. Go ahead, Joshua.
No, I was just I think Monica, you nailed it. And just kind of double click on a little bit. I just, when I think about those institutions that you mentioned in relationship to the police, and the necessity to kind of defund and abolish the police, I think largely about the overall interactions that Black, brown, and poor people in this country and in this world that are affected by the imperialist occupation have with the carceral state at large, right? And so, like, when we talk about pulling one piece of this away, when we're talking about, in this particular conversation, we're talking about the police. we're not just simply focusing on simply just the institution of police. We're talking about the overall carceral state and how we interact with it, right? When you think about, you know, Black neighborhoods in North Philly, I spent a lot of time in Philadelphia. My family's, from that area. Every other hood I've been to across the country and spent time in, there are surveillance cameras all through our neighborhoods, right? There are ways that we are surveilled by police and other folks, right? And not just police, but also, the Karens of the world that are like constantly calling the police and videotaping what they think is criminal behavior, what actually isn't, right? That's an interaction with surveillance, right? And so what we're talking about when we say abolish the police is not just simply the institution of policing, but what policing is connected to and everything that it's a part of, the action that it takes, right? When you call police for whether it's a resistance to gentrification or it's a false quote unquote loitering claim of young Black men and women and people hanging out on a corner that they're from, in a neighborhood that they're from, right? That used to be kind of theirs, but now it's kind of transitioning to be some like wealthy white people's neighborhood, right? All those things are like what we're addressing when we talk about defunding and abolishing the police. So I think it's emblematic, more so in my mind, than it is necessarily specific to the role of police. It's emblematic of the larger system in and of itself. And that once we discredit one of the clear kind of foundations of the carceral state, right, we have ground to then kind of completely discredit the entire foundation of the entire thing.
Mm-hmm. And let me just say, just because it's, again, this rebellion has just changed everything. I can't say it enough. Now you have young people who are demanding that the police get out of their schools. They are demanding the end of the militarization of their schools. Why are the police in our schools? When young people, they can connect with each other, they can, de-escalate whatever happens, if there's some issue, the police just makes it worse. They make it worse. So this is what I'm saying. This rebellion is just, because people are now connected. They don't feel the isolation because they're in the streets together. They're intermingling with each other, despite the COVID situation, but it's not this isolation anymore. They're finding out what they have in common and what they don't have in common. They're learning from each other. The best education in the world is in the streets. It's really in the streets. And so, and I think those who are fearful about with the one question, well, there can be some training, the community, there's something called workers' assemblies. I know Joshua knows this very well because there's the Southern Workers' Assemblies. There's worker assemblies all around the world coming out of the Occupy movement. And these assemblies can be ways and vehicles for neighborhoods, let's say, to come together and figure out, well, how can we keep our neighborhoods safe without the police? They pool resources. They demand, money, resources from the city to take care of themselves. So this is what we mean by empowering people. People need to be empowered in order to carry out these services. And the last thing, our youth need jobs. Youth need jobs. When I was in Ferguson, just a week after Michael Brown was killed, and I was interviewing some Black youth, and I said, well, why are you, and we were protesting like late at night, and I asked them, I said, well, why are you here? Thinking that they were going to say, well, I want justice for my friend. I want justice for Mike Brown. And a number of them said, I don't want to be targeted by the police. I want to be in a union. I want a job. I don't want to be incarcerated. I want to be in a union. And we have a editorial in our paper right now that says, get the cop unions out and get the youth in. There's no reason why the union should not be organizing Black and brown youth into the unions. They need a job. They need to feel connected, not disenfranchised.
I just wanted real quick to respond to, I think, the second part of the question. You all did a really amazing job with the first part. I think someone was asking about, or saying that they have a son and they're concerned about how the call for defunding the police will lead to violence. And I think, unfortunately, no matter what we say when we're pushing these ideas, will lead to certain segments of this white supremacist society to respond with violence. And we've already seen that here in Philly. There's a neighborhood called Fishtown, and it's a highly gentrified area. Previously, this would be the place where you would see a lot of ethnic whites, Italians, Irish folks. A lot of the cops that we've been talking about, they would live there for generations with their community. But Philly has become very popular in the last 20, 30 years. And so we have a bunch of gentrifiers from New York, DC, and other places who have moved to this particular ethnic white enclave and have taken over. And so there's a lot of class tensions, of course, but this has always been a place that was super racist as well. I remember being in middle school and one of my classmates, same age and grade as me, her brothers attacked a Black family who happened to move in to their block. And so this was in the mid-90s, and it's literally the same things that are going on today. And Philly in the mid-90s was, you know, an era of like Clinton and all this new money, and even Black folks in Philly at this time had money to an extent, and it was like a very, very, you know, weird, like hyper-capitalist time. And so I'm just saying that to say that even when, you know, things were supposedly better, you still had the same type of repression going on. And so I don't think that's going to change by us simply saying, oh, we're going to change our demand to defund the police or abolish the police to something else. And so I think the answer is not to change our strategies or our messaging, but to create more community so that we're not subject to these types of attacks. And I think that we really should be having more discussions about things like self-defense. And I'll just leave it at that. But that question is super important. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. And yeah, I think both all of our panelists and Ezra, you know, have talked about how the abolition of police will make us safer. I know last Monday when the Philadelphia police tear gassed the Vine Street Expressway, it was a very dangerous situation for people trying to escape from the tear gas. And instantly, as we were scrambling up the embankment to try and get over those fences, people immediately started helping each other over. I injured my shoulder. I wouldn't have made it over had it not been the people who instantly started protecting our fellow workers. So indeed, community control will make us safer. The absence of police will make us safer. Folks, as we approach 9:30 now, I do want to just sort of ask our final two questions and sort of get everybody to weigh in on these two subjects. The first one is that the City Council of Minneapolis recently announced plans to dismantle the police department. Cities across the country are calling for spending cuts for law enforcement, increased spending for education and social needs. What is the significance of this movement, and what's driving these demands? And maybe most importantly, how can we make sure they follow through on these promises? And related, I think, our final question is, we have learned about the establishment of a cop-free autonomous zone in Seattle. And I wonder if folks would like to weigh in on the significance of this development as well. So that's two subjects for us: Minneapolis dismantling their police and the Capitol Hill autonomous zone in Seattle.
Well, the simple answer is that the rebellion has changed everything. I can't. Who would have thought that over 2 weeks ago, this is what we will be discussing? I mean, it was mainly COVID-19. I mean, it's you know, getting ready for another wave of, you know, of this virus, and how people are suffering, and people are still suffering, of course. But again, the rebellion just changed the whole landscape. And it's because of what's been going on below, the sustained protest. This is the 17th day of protest. That didn't even happen around Ferguson, I don't think. I don't think, you know, there was a lot of protests around Eric Garner and, you know, Tamir Rice and so forth, but nothing like this, especially on a global scale. Who would have thought we would have seen a police station burn down? You know, cop cars you see burned down, you know, and so forth in any rebellion, but a police station being burned? You know, this rebellion shows the possibilities. It shows the possibilities. And the fact that 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council voted not only to defund, but dismantle the police force, at least the current one. Now, they haven't said what they're going to replace it with. And they've already gotten pushback from the Minneapolis police chief and so forth. So that struggle, that's going to be an ongoing struggle. That's going to be ongoing. But that came from the Black community. It came from a group called Black Visions in Minneapolis. That's very, very important. And they certainly reflect the wishes of this oppressed community, where 60% of the arrests were in the Black community. And Minneapolis is only 20% Black. So again, and Seattle, you know, again, it's the rebellion. They're trying to show what the possibilities are. It's just one city, you know, they've taken on an open police station. I'm sure they were inspired by what happened in Minneapolis and other places around the country. So it's a very fluid situation with all of these things. But the main thing is that it's front and center in terms of the debate. The police are on trial on a global scale. The police are on trial and people say they're guilty. You know, they know that they're guilty, but it's for the whole world to see. So it's we just have to keep monitoring the situation, but it just shows that the possibilities are just endless around these questions. And we have to offer some organization, some, you know, again, solidarity, but what is the logical conclusion? That's, you know, I think that's what all revolutionaries, those who consider ourselves revolutionaries and socialists, this is what we need to be figuring out while still showing solidarity with all of these different actions.
Thank you, Monica. Does anyone else want to take up either one of these questions or both?
Just real quick, I personally, as someone who has been so committed to direct action, super inspired by Seattle taking over the police station. Like, I don't think that people know like how difficult that is, like just physically and organizationally to take over a police station. You know, every time we've ever protested in front of a police station, it's like, you know, rows and rows of bike cops, and they are like defending this police station with their lives. And so to me, it's a major win for the movement, but also people dedicated to direct action tactics to see this type of move coming out of Seattle. And right now in Philadelphia, we're going to be in for another fight. One of the most violent police districts, the 22nd district in North Philly, is attempting to build a brand new, sparkling police station in the middle of a global pandemic. Right after, you know, our city engaged in rebellion and is continuing to rebel, and our city government just does not seem to get it. And I think that this is a particular problem in these, you know, very old Northeast cities with their long-standing political machines, that they don't think that they have to listen to us. And so I think that the battles that we'll see in this part of the country will be even more long-term and entrenched than in other areas. And that's not to say that, you know, what people are going through in other places aren't difficult, because they are, but I think that we're just in a unique situation politically in places like Philly And, you know, with what we've seen with like Rizzo and how he had emboldened the police. And so I think that, you know, what we're going to have to do here is like, you know, really like physically take down, you know, these police station and, you know, make these cops just as afraid as they are in Seattle. Like I read the article and they were just like, okay, we're going to move away and you can come in. I just have never seen that before. And I think it's super awesome.
Yeah, and you know, it's the multinational character of this movement. It's scaring them to death. These are not, of course, Black youth are leading the way, but these are Black and white, indigenous, Asian. It's so multinational. It is so young, and they see no future under capitalism. There's no future for them. So it's not just the police were the spark, but this is against white supremacy and and capitalism that upholds all of these different repressions and oppressions. This is what I think ultimately our youth are fighting against. This is an anti-capitalist rebellion, and it's growing by leaps and bounds.
Thanks, folks. As we're almost at 9:30 now, I want to propose that we sort of start taking these as our final comments for the panelists. And Joshua, I'm wondering if you'd like to make any final comments as well. Just as we out.
Again, thank you all for having me on the call. I sincerely appreciate being able to share ideas and be in conversation with you all about this particular moment and historical relevance, etc. And it's been something that's been on my mind quite a bit. So this has been a wonderful experience. The last thing, one thing I just want to kind of lift up in kind of the same lane of the last question, and this will be like kind of my final comments, is that, you know, as we celebrate the moments of traction that's gained in these particular rebellions and uprisings that we're seeing around the world, in direct resistance and contrast and conflict with capitalism, we should also be aware of the retaliation. And I think that we have seen that in evidence through history with white supremacy, you know, in multitude, right? As recently as, you know, in a legislative fight, in as simple as a legislative fight in Florida, right, with Amendment 4 giving formerly incarcerated folks or felons convicted of felonies the right to vote, and what immediately happened afterwards, right, is it's like a very aggressive attempt to take that away. And so what we should know and what we should note in this particular moment is that as we celebrate our traction as moving forward, we know that our enemy is constantly planning and plotting against us, right? And so we should be very aware and cognizant of that in this particular moment. Yes, we need to celebrate. Yes, we need to uplift and bring joy in the moments that we are gaining traction. And then also we can walk in true gum at the same time. You know what I mean? We need to know, I think it was Maya Angelou said, that when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And so we know who our enemy is, and we don't need to believe that they're anybody different. And that goes with all the solidarity movements and statements of corporations and athletes and celebrities all throughout the globe that have come in, that have finally kind of quote unquote come in to make statements with us in this particular movement. We know who you are. We know what your record is. That's the beautiful thing of the internet, as my homies say. We can pull your receipts, and so we know exactly who you are, and we will pull those receipts, and we'll keep a record of who you are. And until completely proven otherwise, until your actions change, the words you say will not mean a thing to us.
Comrades and siblings, I think that is a gripping and great note to end on. And I cannot thank our panelists enough for being on tonight. I hope that everyone listening on Zoom and on Facebook, on YouTube, have enjoyed tonight's webinar as much as I have. You know, Workers' World Party needs your support to continue the revolutionary struggle in this country. We would love to have you. We need members. We need financial support. We are in the streets every day. We're doing jail support. We're helping with mutual aid programs. We're showing solidarity. We're a totally volunteer organization, and we depend upon donations from people like you for our survival. Under capitalism, we need, material resources to do the work we do. So any amount that you can donate will help, and we will put it all into continuing the struggle to bring down this rotten, racist, oppressive system. So you can see now on the screen, you can donate in 3 ways. You can Venmo Workers' World Party at Workers' World. You can go to workers.org/donate. And if you'd like to subscribe to our Patreon, it's patreon.com/WWP. And those resources go to our prisoner subscription program, providing Workers' World newspaper to our incarcerated brothers, sisters, and siblings, where it's really used as an organizing tool behind the walls. This is a hugely important part of our solidarity with people behind bars and behind walls of U.S. prisons, jails, and detention centers, which Workers' World maintains strongly are concentration camps for the poor and oppressed. Our newly formed, or really relaunched, Prisoner Solidarity Committee of Workers' World Party is active. Again, it was an organization, a committee that was first formed around the struggles in Attica and Auburn. I would like to just briefly say that we raise up the name of Comrade Tom Soto, who passed away recently, who was actually a negotiator on behalf of the Prisoner Solidarity Committee of Workers' World Party during the Attica Rebellion. And so we say loudly, free them all.
Thank you so much to everyone for participating tonight. This webinar has been organized by Workers' World Party, a Marxist-Leninist organization fighting for revolution in the belly of the beast. If you are interested in learning more and joining, go to workers.org and sign up. We hope that you'll join us next week, Thursday, June 18th at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific for our next webinar. Stay safe and keep fighting for a real workers' world.
Thanks,
Go
everybody.
Workers' World.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Megan. Bye, Joshua.
Bye, guys.
Have a great night,
Everybody.
folks. Thanks so much.
Okay.